Good morning. Our presentation is going to discuss son preference, the consequences associated with this phenomenon, and current approaches to solving this issue. My name is Meg Bergman, and I'm joined by my teammates Lindsay Ballinger, Sharon Cho, and Joanne Kim. So, the focus of our presentation is going to be on 5 main articles. It'll kind of introduce us to the concept of women's empowerment and economic development, and then walk us through a status quo, go into a few solution approaches that were attempted, and lastly finish with a broader scope. So as we've seen in class, gender inequality is a big issue, and we can see these trends depending on the GDP or GNI of a country. As that increases, we have the gap decrease between men and women, and that's mirrored in health, in education, and in decision making. The first article I will discuss is Esther Duflo's 2012 Women Empowerment and Economic Development. The World Bank estimates that every year there are about 6 million missing women, or women who should be alive but aren't. In addition to this extreme measurement of discrimination, Duflo notes numerous studies that show discrimination against women in the household, within political representation, and legal rights. Therefore, the question trying to be answered in this comprehensive meta-analysis is where policy should be targeted. Is focusing on economic development or focusing on women's empowerment more important, and which one has more consequences? We know that crises have a greater negative impact on girls and women because they're less valued. During droughts in India, mortality rates of girls compared to boys spike. Additionally, lower life expectancy causes devaluation from a young age. Childbearing is inherently dangerous, but areas that reduce maternal mortality saw an increase in the years of education of girls. So yes, encouraging economic growth and opening up the economy benefits women. The second question is considered valuable for 2 different reasons. First, inequality is morally wrong. Therefore, because women have less rights, we need to target policies to help them. Secondly, studies have been released that show that women are able to increase economic growth, and therefore we should empower them so we can see an increase in development. Mothers' education earnings have been strongly correlated with child's welfare, especially in terms of health. It's been explicitly proven that women when they're able to have more weight in decision-making, they benefit their households and communities. So, Duflo's article points out that correlation goes both ways. Development will encourage women empowerment, and empowering women will have a direct impact on development through changing decision-making. However, it is worth noting that economic development alone is not sufficient in ensuring enough progress, particularly when faced with negative, pervasive stereotypes of women's ability. Therefore, it's necessary to create policies that will benefit women at the expense of men. This redistribution of power and resources will enable economic development and influence a positive cycle of women empowerment and the growth of the economy.
This is Joanne, and I will be discussing the article on the quantity and quality of girls, new evidence on abortion, fertility, and parental investments by Anukriti, Balotra, and Tam. It is important to understand how we got to the point in society of son preference, what evidence there are, and also how it affects us today. The article essentially discusses the impact of ultrasound technology in mid-1980s India. The authors used regression analysis to examine the following data: mothers' preferences in ideal fertility rate and sex ratios, actual sex ratios at birth, neonatal and before age 5 mortality rates, school enrollment, and parental investments with breastfeeding, immunization, and children's health expenditure. The strength of this article is that it attempts to eliminate biases within regression analysis following the changing societal contexts in India. For example, the article addresses the liberalization of women's economic activities in India by including the control for women's self-reported preferences for the ideal number and sex ratio of children. The weakness at the same time is that the study is only conducted in India, and therefore the conclusions reached could potentially have a hard time being generalized to other developing countries. The findings of the study are very interesting. Ultrasound availability led to a significant decline in the excess female mortality for those under the age of 5. It also led to an increase in abortion of female fetuses by parents who did not want a girl. That being said, the study sees that girls who survives to birth post-ultrasound era is more likely to survive later because she is born into a family that wants her. This is supported by the increased parental investments in breastfeeding, immunization, and the tendency for school enrollment. This is a graph that shows the relationship between the number of abortions and ultrasound used by mothers. We see that the more the mothers use ultrasound, the more likely there is to be an abortion. Another finding is that with the introduction of ultrasound technology, it drove actual fertility closer to desired fertility. What this means is that mothers stopped overbearing children in order to bear sons. Before ultrasound, women whose first child was a girl were more likely to give birth in a given year and had more births than women with a first son. More can be seen in the next graphs. Female birth increases slightly when they are the first births. However, as the number of children increase, female births decrease more and more if there are no sons. We see that mothers are possibly aborting female babies to make sure that at least one boy will be born into the family without having too many children in the family. In conclusion, analysis shows that the increase in sex-selective abortions fueled by ultrasound technology substantially and ironically decreased postnatal gender discrimination against girl children in India. The shocking truth about the study was that for every additional girl that survived after birth, 3 girls were aborted. We see that son preference inherently denies the existence of girls. Because families preferred sons, the option to abort female babies ironically decreased the deliberate neglect of girls after they were born.
Part of what Joanne's paper focused on was the quantity of girls in India. One paper that evaluates a potential way to solve these issues is Financial Incentives in the Fertility-Sex Ratio Trade-Off, written by S. Anukriti in 2016. This paper seeks to address 2 main goals: reduce the sex ratio and reduce fertility. In short, the findings of this paper are that because demand for sons is less price elastic than demand for daughters, financial incentives cannot resolve the fertility-sex ratio trade-off. We already know why decreasing sex ratio is important. However, we have not yet discussed why reducing fertility is an important goal for a developing nation. As seen in this graph, there is strong historic evidence that there is an inverse relationship between fertility and economic development. Additionally, we noted in class that a large population can lead to inequality when resources are limited. While decreasing both fertility and the sex ratio are clearly good goals, issues arise with accomplishing these goals simultaneously. As seen in this graph, researchers have found that specifically targeting a decrease in either the sex ratio or fertility leads to an increase in the other due to their inverse relationship. For example, if a study targets reducing the sex ratio by incentivizing parents to have more girls, fertility increases because girls and boys are seen as imperfect substitutes and families may desire a minimum number of sons. In an attempt to counteract the inverse relationship between fertility and the sex ratio, a program called Devi Rupak has attempted to create incentives that target both goals simultaneously. Devi Rupak is a conditional cash transfer program in Haryana, India, started in 2002. While a weakness of this paper is that it focuses on only one state in India, Haryana was carefully chosen because it is the Indian state that had the highest sex ratio in 2013. Under Devi Rupak, eligible couples received monthly payments for a period of 20 years after undergoing sterilization. The financial incentives for couples who have only one child who is a girl is 500 rupees a month, while couples who have only one child who is a boy or have 2 children who are both girls receive 200 rupees a month. This paper analyzed the impact of Devi Rupak on both the composition and number of children that parents have. The graphs show the proportion of couples in Haryana having each composition of children in a given year. The dotted vertical line falls in 2002, the year the program was introduced. The solid line represents the actual data, while the dashed line represents an estimation of what the proportion of each family composition would be without the program. As seen in Graph A, there was a significant divergence in the proportion of couples having only one boy, with the incentives causing a sharp increase. This is explained by the fact that when son preference is strong, couples will choose to have one son and receive benefits rather than having a son and a daughter. Because of this, Devi Rupak increased the sex ratio through differential stopping and sex selection at the first and second parities. In graphs B and C, we can see that Devi Rupak had almost no effect on the proportion of couples having either 1 or 2 girls. Overall, the program did not succeed in reducing the sex ratio because the financial incentives were not powerful enough to counteract son preference. The sex ratio increased despite the incentives being set up such that couples were more heavily encouraged to have girls than boys. This slide examines the effects of Devi Rupak on the average number of children per couple in each year of the study. As Graph D shows, the program resulted in a noticeable decline in living children. However, it is clear from graphs E and F that the decline is driven by a sharp decline in living girls and a small decrease in living boys. While this clearly accomplishes the goal of decreasing fertility, it does so through increasing the sex ratio and therefore fails the goal of decreasing both simultaneously. Despite this failure, a strength of this paper is that it proposes a way in which the program could be modified. Anukriti suggests the incentive for having only one boy should be removed and no longer give reason for couples who have a firstborn son to stop having children. Thus, the sex ratio could drop as families with strong son preference have more kids, some of whom could be female, though the effects on fertility would be unknown.
A second way to look at the issue of son preference and gender inequality is to look at the quality of lives of the unpreferred daughters. In a paper titled "Does Increased Access Increase Equality?" Emily Oster takes a look at access to health services and its contribution to gender equality. It is commonly thought that higher access to resources would lower the level of inequality. However, Oster reports that empirical evidence is mixed, and that is exactly what Oster found from her studies. Access and inequality have non-monotonous relationship, resembling Kuznets' curve that we learned about in class regarding the relationship between inequality and economic development. Here's how she constructed the model using the theory of discriminatory investment. First, there are two types of individuals. These individuals will get investments according to their costs and values. The inequality in the investment is measured by the difference between the shares of each group, shown here as theta. Based on this model, she concludes two propositions. First, when investment costs are high, decreases in the cost result in increased bias towards the advantaged group. This effect reverses as the cost decreases. Second, when the relative value of the advantaged group is higher, we expect a larger relationship between access and inequality. Then she applies this model identically to evaluate the relationship between gender inequality and access to vaccinations. Boys and girls are two groups. Value is measured by the differences in the probability of survival with and without vaccination. Not surprisingly, we expect the same propositions, a non-monotonic relationship between access to vaccinations and inequality, and this relationship should be larger among families with stronger son preference. At this point, the strength of this paper are the following. First, there is a clear evidence of gender discrimination in India. Second, vaccinations fit well into the framework of the model because they are an investment with saturation. And vaccination is an important factor in under 5 mortality rate. Third, the level of access to health care can be measured by the variations in the availability of health camps in India. However, the placement of health camps is not coincidental, but also claims that these factors can be controlled for. From the data, Oster finds another confirmation that there is at least some gender discrimination in vaccinations in the sample. The more important result can be seen in these graphs. The gender difference in average number of vaccinations for children and for each gender, graphed against the number of vaccination camps in the left, and the distance to nearest vaccination source in the right. In both, we see a non-monotonic relationship. This finding suggests that policymakers should saturate one area with health intervention in order to quickly target gender inequality in access to health inputs. However, Oster warns that this concentrated efforts will inevitably result in hurting other forms of equality, such as regional inequality. So far, we have looked at the solution approaches to directly target sex ratio and gender equality. And now, we'd like to address the so what question and relate back to economic development as introduced by Meg. I will address the broader scope of gender equality and its relation to economic development with our last paper, Does Female Empowerment Promote Economic Development? Empirical evidence suggests that money in the hands of mothers increases expenditures on children, including this case of missing women and the price of tea in China. Furthermore, organizations and governments emphasize empowerment of women as a means for economic growth. However, does targeting transfers to women actually promote economic development? Before we answer the question, let's build the model used in this paper. First, they distinguish between private goods and public goods. Both men and women derive utility from public goods, and this provision is decided in non-cooperative decision-making process. As for the effect of mandated transfers, transfers to the lower wage spouse increase the provision of public goods provided by this spouse. In this graph, we can see that wife has a comparative advantage at providing time-sensitive public goods given her lower market wage. Thirdly, they address the presence of voluntary transfers, and they define and differentiate between efficient allocation and specialization. Next, their growth model is a lot like the Cobb-Douglas production function and the solo growth model that we used in our class. Given this function, mandated transfer to women will increase human capital. Then, these transfers increase growth depending on the share of human capital in production. In this graph, the targeted transfers may be beneficial at human capital intensive production stage. One thing that my team especially liked about this paper is that its predictions hold even when men and women have symmetric preferences. When tested with the empirical data from Progresa program in Mexico, the predictions are matching. Notice that after the cash transfer, saving decreases while consumption on women's private goods and public goods increase. This article does well on providing differentiated views when it comes to assumptions and conclusions. Also, the empirical data analysis provides results that are consistent with the past studies on the same data. However, it seems like the paper is only testing half of the argument. To be specific, it needs more empirical evidence of women empowerment policies in different stages of economic development. In conclusion, what they argue is that the effectiveness of empowerment policies depends on both the gender wage gap in the labor market and the stages of development represented by production functions. So the best case for these kinds of targeted transfers could be made for countries at an intermediate stage of development, when human capital is already a key driver of growth, but women's labor market opportunities still lag behind men's. Therefore, when devising policies to empower women and reduce the gender inequality, the stage of development should be taken into consideration.
In this presentation, we have discussed the impact of son preference on economic development. We have also noted how and when policies can improve development through reductions in son preference and by empowering women. Using the lessons from these papers, we can understand how to create a more equitable world. Thank you.